Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to the International Association of Religion Journalists' fourth global dialogue on religion and politics. We have some wonderful religion journalists from Canada and the United States joining one of the preeminent political scientists on this topic and discussing the intersection of faith and politics in this critical stage of world history. The event is one in a series that earlier dialogues on religion and politics took place in Asia, the Mediterranean, and Latin America, and today's event is for the North American dialogue is of particular interest given all the different challenges religious communities face, from the most recent Soviet invasion of the Ukraine to the continuing threat of the COVID pandemic, all amid a rising toxic polarization and public discourse. And before we begin, I'd just like to invite you all to take advantage of everything the iARJ has to offer online, including the past recorded streams of the dialogues I mentioned earlier, and just a plethora of data to assist religion journalists in understanding events in context of various parts of the world. Let me briefly introduce our panel participants, and do it in alphabetical order. John Longhurst, religion reporter and columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press since 2003. He also writes for Religion News Service and other outlets. He is the author of Making the News, an essential guide for effective media relations. And he organized Canada's first ever conference on faith and media in Ottawa in 1998. He has been a stalwart in interfaith relations and in his work with the media. Then Alejandra Molina, national religion writer for the Religion News Service. Alejandra most recently served as journalist in residence at the University of Southern California and as Equitable Cities Fellow at Next City. She has worked at the Press Enterprise, La Prensa, and OC Excelsior, and the Orange County Register. In 2018, she was named one of the 15 most influential Latina journalists by Latino Journalists of California. And Richard Osling, religion writer and author. His work appears in many different outlets, prominent outlets, including Get Religion, where he has thoughtful analysis of religion coverage. He's the former senior religion correspondent for Time Magazine, chief religion writer for the Associated Press. Dick was the first correspondent regularly covering religion for a network TV newscast, working part-time with the PBS NewsHour and aired CBS radio religion reports for 2 decades. He and his late wife, Joan, co-authored Mormon America, The Power and the Promise, extraordinarily well-received book. He received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Religion Newswriters Association, where he also served as president. And Corwin Smith, professor emeritus of political science and senior fellow and former director of the Paul B. Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics at Calvin College. Well, I've known Corwin for 40 years, and it's just impossible to sum up his incredible curriculum vitae. But His many influential books include American Evangelicals Today from 2015, The Disappearing God Gap, Religion, the 2008 Election, and he was co-editor in 2017 of the seminal Oxford Handbook of Religion and American Politics. We're so fortunate to have Corwin and each of these panelists with us today. And we thought we'd begin by asking each of the panelists to reflect on what they consider, the critical issues in religion and politics in North America today. And absolutely, we'll start in the same order. John, would you care to begin?
Sure. Thanks, David. Appreciate it so much. Religion is an important topic around the world, and I just want to focus a little bit on Canada today. In 2018, a major international summit on the role of civil society was held here in Canada. It brought together representatives from all the G7 member states and the European Union. The purpose was to discuss ways to create a fairer and more sustainable world. At the summit, a wide array of civil society groups were recognized for the ways they can help reach that goal. Labor unions, NGOs, community groups, charitable organizations, professional associations, etc. But one important group that was not included was the faith community. Not one speaker, presenter, or panelist was invited from a faith group, and the subject of religion didn't come up once. In a conversation after the summit with an organizer, he told me the idea of including faith leaders never came up in the planning. In retrospect, he said, he acknowledged this was an oversight. And I agree. By not including anyone from the faith community or discussing the role religion plays in civil society, the summit missed hearing from one of the largest and most influential civil society groups in Canada. Now, we normally don't think of religion as a civil society group, but it is. It brings people together for a common purpose beyond worship services. They meet to volunteer, to raise money for community needs, or to campaign for causes they believe in. Not only that, on any given weekend, as many as 4 million Canadians from different faith groups participate in worship services, which is more than any other activity that brings Canadians together. And at those services, they hear about, pray for, and raise funds for their communities, for Canada, and the world. But so what? Canada is a very secular country after all, and attendance at and affiliation with religious groups in Canada is dropping. So why should it be included in a discussion about civil society and the role that that might play in politics? And I can think of at least 4 reasons. 1, organized religion is one of the major gateways to participation in civil society, whether it's people learning about and praying for local, national, or world needs, volunteering, learning leadership skills, or campaigning for issues they care about. Faith communities provide members with doorways to involvement in civil society. Secondly, the charitable sector depends on religious people. People who give the most come from religious groups, and they give the most often. Religiosity is one of the main drivers of charitable giving and volunteering in Canada. For this reason, the decline in attendance at churches, in particular, portends a grave situation for charities in this country. Or as I tell friends who tell me they don't care if all the churches in Canada close, I say, you'll miss us when we're gone. Religion also plays a key role in international development. We see this in Afghanistan right now, where it's an impediment to girls getting an education. In other places, if a local religious leader doesn't support a project, it just won't happen. And finally, religion is a key economic force in Canada. It's something called the halo effect, and you may have heard about it. The halo effect estimates that faith groups in this country provide over $20 billion of social, spiritual, and communal service to Canadian towns and cities every year. This is everything from soup kitchens to homeless shelters to using sanctuaries for concerts to hosting addictions programs to setting up a basketball hoop in the church parking lot. In other words, if a downtown church closes and is replaced by a condo building, it's unlikely the new residents will include a homeless shelter. Quickly to today, things have not changed.
John?
Now,
John?
religion continues to get little attention unless there's a scandal. And I think media needs to do a better job of reminding people of the role of religion in civil society and politics today. Thanks, David.
Well, thank you so much, John. And I apologize. I'm not a guy to be moderator, but thank you. Alejandra, what are some of the, in your role at Religion News Service, what are some of the issues you're looking at and is particularly pressing in terms of religion and politics?
Yeah, so what I consider significant right now in religion and politics involves the religious response and the religion freedom issues at play over legislation across the country that seeks to limit abortion. With the restrictive abortion law in Texas, which took effect last September, we heard from a range of faith leaders and who condemned the law, which allows any person to sue those who help a woman or a pregnant person get an abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. We heard from Rabbi Kelly Levy in Austin, Texas, who noted that Jewish tradition states that the life of the mother, first and foremost, is a priority. So to rabbis, life is defined as beginning at first breath, which is different than how other faiths have defined life. Other faiths define it as conception, they define it as first breath. And under Islamic law, medieval Muslim scholars have allowed women to terminate a pregnancy before 120 days. So those scholars look at the theological conception as a start of life, as opposed to a scientific conception as a start of life. From a theological perspective, they came to terms with the idea that a fetus is not ensouled at conception, rather 120 days after the fact. So for that reason, that termination was not a termination of life. And we also have to consider the pastors and faith leaders who counsel pregnant people as they make reproductive care decisions. So this law in Texas allows any person to sue those who help a woman get an abortion. This can affect anybody from the physicians who perform the abortion to clergy who counsel or assist an abortion patient. Faith leaders who I've spoken with say they aren't telling them to get an abortion or not, but they reflect with the pregnant person to help them make the decision for themselves. So if someone found out
Alejandra, I'm sorry. Can
okay,
we,
I'll wrap it up. So if someone found out a pastor had a conversation with somebody who ultimately chose an abortion, one pastor I spoke with feared that she would be sued. She said it violates her religious freedom as a pastor, and it's an invasion of that sacred pastor-parishioner relationship, she said. So it'll be interesting to see how this issue plays out and how it could affect religious people who are Jewish and Muslim and living in states with these kind of restrictive laws at play.
Well, thank you. And again, I thought when I asked an academic and told him 3 or 4 minutes in the first, I'd be in trouble. I should have known journalists wouldn't be any different, you know. But if we could take pity on me, and we'll try to kind of move the conversation along. But thank you so much, John and Alejandra. And Richard?
Yeah, just a couple comments. John's points, we could add very interesting research at Harvard and Columbia University on the physical and mental health and life outcome benefits from religious involvement. Very, very good story there. And abortion, I want to focus on partisan politics. And in case particularly folks overseas don't know this, we have a bomb going off in June. U.S. Supreme Court is going to rule on a relatively restrictive law from the state of Mississippi, but it has implications, obviously, for the entirety of American politics and all religious groups, most of whom filed briefs in that case. My focus is going to be the partisan politics situation in this country. Not only what's happening in terms of 2022 midterm elections, as we call them, but the presidential elections. I dug up some interesting data on this, which I'll share as the conversation goes along if it seems pertinent. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Richard, Dick. Corwin, could you please offer us your opening reflections?
Yeah, I think a couple points with regard to thinking about party politics in the United States. First of all, one of the things that has been happening, at least in the academic world, is a growing discussion of the extent to which, rather than religion shaping politics, to what extent politics may now shape religion, and has political identity really sort of become nothing more than an alternative religion itself. So I'll leave it at that. I do also want to talk a little bit about some of the problems of measurement in terms of religion, the born again or evangelical question. I can talk a little bit about some of the difficulties of that particular question, and perhaps talk a little bit about another common topic, or at least a phrase that we hear in both academic and journalistic discourse, and that is Christian nationalism and its effects on American politics. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much, Corwin. And, well, all thoughtful topics. If I may just start out with an opening question, and whoever is comfortable in responding, please do. I know many of our international colleagues and viewers may have a particular interest in how religion may influence the upcoming fall elections, and looking beyond that to the prospects for figures such as Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election. Well, Corwin, maybe I can start with you. What is your perspective? Do you have any particular thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there's a couple things to think about. Certainly, the war in Ukraine, it may very well have some effects in terms of altering what was anticipated to be, at least in the 2022 election, the Republican Party sort of recapturing control of Congress. That may still occur, but certainly the Ukraine situation has cast a new light on how people are looking at the political events, how people are discussing, what people are discussing, what's the concerns that they're expressing. And so it may have some impact there. With regard to 2024, it's still an unknown. Part of it is, I presume, Biden's an older president. At least a couple of years ago, I would have said he's a one-term president just in terms of age, if nothing else, and that there would have to be a transition. The Democratic Party would have to come up with an alternative candidate. The Republican Party is split too. There's many Republicans who don't want Trump to run, but who's an alternative. I mean, right now, there's no real figure that emerges as sort of a unifying figure within the party that could really be at this point, a strong candidate in 2024. So religion comes into play. Catholics, one of the things that's happening with regard to Catholics is we're seeing more Latinos moving towards the Republican Party in recent elections. Certainly, Latino Protestants have been more Republican than Latino Catholics, but Latino Catholics have moved more Republican compared in 2020 compared to 2016. And so there's some discussion of what's happening among Hispanics and in American politics. And I'll just leave it at that.
Alejandro or Dick, would you?
Yeah, so I'd like to talk more about, I know there's always a lot of interest in Latinos and the Latino vote during election season. So, when I first started working at RNS more than 2 years ago, one of the first stories that I wrote was about Pew Research findings that showed Latinos in the US were no longer majority Catholic. And so that was huge. And there's now a larger share of unaffiliated Latinos, and there's also large Latino Protestant communities. But there was also this like really interesting data that came out from the Public Religion Research Institute in late 2020, showing that Latino Protestants were more conservative and more supportive of Trump than than Latino Catholics. And that study referred to religion as being like the largest demographic divider among Latinos in the US. So it just goes back to the reminder that Latinos are not this monolithic community of voters, and religion is among many other reasons why. I spoke with Jonathan Calvillo. He's a sociology of religion professor at Boston University, and he said that Latino congregants in evangelical and Pentecostal communities, they often hear their pastors and leaders preach favorably of Trump. And so they either endorsed Trump or gave a more apolitical stance, kind of like they'll say something like, let's just pray whoever's in office or pray for our leaders. And among Catholics, it can be helpful to remember that the Catholic history of liberation theology, much of it which comes from Latin America, it manifests in the US context. So you still have priests here in the US who are inclined toward liberation theology, but it's just I feel like my role has also been to kind of help explain these nuances, because there is no voting bloc among Latinos, and religion is one main factor where these differences come from.
Thank you. Dick, did you want to join in on this? Or
Yeah, a couple of things. Full page here I'm looking at in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago by two Democrats who are begging them not to, as it says here, throw it all away in 2024. And there's a quote here. It says that cultural and religious factors are so often forgotten, and they're often more important than economic, which is generally what the press deals with. And they did a very interesting thing. They added up all the votes for United States president in the last generation, which gives you about 1 million votes. And the totals come out 51% Democrats, 49% Republicans. In other words, newsflash, this is a politically divided country. Look at the US House right now, look at the US Senate, and polls certainly underscore this. Okay, doesn't look like that's going to change, at least in the immediate future. Now, from the religious standpoint, as far as I'm concerned, 2 words, white Catholics. That is the huge story of the United States politically since 1968. 60 was Jack Kennedy. That was, in the Catholic factor, a different election. 64, Goldwater got slammed by LBJ. Okay, but if you take from 1968 through 2020, the big story in American religion is non-Hispanic or white so-called Catholics have been an important swing vote. And secondly, they've swung back and forth, but the trend is very solidly going Republican. And Trump kind of in the second election in 2020 didn't do as well as his predecessors with white Catholics, but they did give him a majority. And you go back with Romney and McCain and George W. Bush, same thing. And there's a steady progression toward the Republican Party. To me, that's the religion political story of our time.
Oh, well, thank you, Dick. And John, I know, well, at least I don't think Canada is as polarized in politics as the United States, but I know you, discussed some of the issues, that is still challenging in Canada in terms of politics. And I believe it was Dick that mentioned earlier about, or Corwin, about nationalism and in Quebec. But can you give us a bit of an overview of Canada in this area, John? John, you got unmute.
Yep.
Yes, thank
Yep.
you.
I started out by saying that religion really isn't getting enough attention in this country. But after I listen to the other panelists and I reflect on the situation in the United States, maybe I should be careful what I wish for, because it's true. Religion really is not a dominant force in politics here. It's true that most evangelicals do support what we call the Conservative Party, which is really more like your Democratic Party in the United States. But evangelicals also support the NDP and the Liberals, which are center left and far left, not in as great a number, but we're simply not as polarized here. And religion simply doesn't come up, and no one cares to ask what religion the prime minister is. He happens to be Roman Catholic, but it's a non-factor. So we simply don't have any of those dynamics, and that's a good thing. But we also don't have any of the other positive things that religion brings too that we don't notice. Quebec, of course, is a completely separate entity, a different nation within Canada, and it views things very differently. It is Roman Catholic nominally, it is part of the culture and the character, but very, very few Quebecers actually go to church anymore. However, they have imported the French sense of secularism from France to Quebec, and so that therefore allows them to create new laws which ban the wearing of religious garb, which is mostly aimed at Muslims in Quebec. The hijab coverings. You can still wear a cross and nobody will call you out. But if you're a teacher and you wear a hijab, you will lose your job. And that's just a very different reality in Quebec that doesn't play out anywhere else in Canada. Right now, the big issue in Canada, and the one that I covered in Rome 2 weeks ago, is the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church and our Indigenous peoples. And it's coming to your country this week or next when the Department of Interior releases its report about your boarding schools. And just as a parenthetical note, Canada based its residential school system, which was terrible, on the boarding school system in the United States. We imported it from the US. So whatever happens here, you can look to your country and say, maybe that's what's coming your way. And right now, the Roman Catholic Church has entered a journey which began with an apology from Pope Francis 2 weeks ago about the way the Catholic Church treated Indigenous people in this country for over 100 years through residential schools. Quick little overview.
Thank you. And some of the significant moral issues, and that some of you have already raised, but I was just wondering some of your perspectives on whether issues like the response to the pandemic that has really, well, all of us worldwide have been concerned with the varying responses to the pandemic. And I think the issue of abortion is also critical. But I was wondering what some of your thoughts are, and please, anyone go ahead in terms of the religious dynamic of the responses to the abortion or the pandemic. I just parenthetically, I just noticed I think it's the most recent issue of the Sociology of Religion, or the maybe another journal where they found that surprisingly prayer and other ways of dealing with the religious ways of dealing with the pandemic, there wasn't much difference between evangelicals or more conservative religious and more liberal perspectives. That for the most part they were able to do both, to pray and to socially distance and to be vaccinated. But the one difference, as some of you mentioned, is nationalist. Nationalists were against anything to do with dealing with the pandemic through scientific means. But let me just listen now to your reflections on these issues like abortion and in response to the pandemic, or any other social moral issues you feel would be going to be critical in the years ahead.
Well, I'll just quickly say that abortion is not an issue in Canada like it is in the United States, so I can't comment on that. Nationalism, we did have a blip of that with our trucker blockades in Canada. In February, we had a Jericho march around Parliament, and you've had those in the United States as well. Some identification of Christianity with the flag, with the country, but it's a very nascent movement. It's very small, but it is growing here too, taking its cues from the United States and maybe also now from Russia.
I would observe this little fact. Okay, the Supreme Court case that I mentioned is the most important religious focus on this question in 50 years. Where are the mainline Protestants? Not a single important amicus brief was filed by the US Supreme Court. The Catholics were in on it, the Orthodox Jews, more liberal Jews, you name it. There was a vacuum. Even though these churches are pro-choice on paper, they did not want to get into it. Fascinating to me. They were the silent voice on that issue. What will they say after the court rules in June?
So if we're still talking about abortion, I have been covering the progressive churches, a lot of it in Texas, who have been standing against these restrictions on abortion. And in one lawsuit that the ACLU filed with the Center for Reproductive Rights, I believe it's called, there were a few clergy leaders that were listed in that lawsuit. And they're coming from it in a way where they're talking about how they minister as pastors to pregnant people who are making choices about their reproductive care. So they have these conversations with them where they help them come to their decision of what they want to do with their pregnancy. They're not telling them what to do, but they're talking to them about it. And in Texas, anybody who aids a person in, like, whether they get an abortion or if they get an abortion, somebody could find out that this pastor had a conversation with this pregnant person who ultimately got an abortion, and that they fear that they could get sued. So so there is that fear, and there were clergy leaders who were listed in that lawsuit against this new law in Texas. And there are churches who are declaring themselves as reproductive freedom congregations. And that movement started in Texas. And it's kind of how some churches are LGBTQ affirming churches. There is a push to have churches affirm the right of women and people to access reproductive care. So there is a movement, and a lot of it has been paid, a lot of attention has been being paid on this in Texas. And I'm curious if there will be more outspoken pastors and churches who are taking a stance on this.
Corwin, would you? And it's not just all interesting points, but I mean, haven't, and I'd be also curious for anyone else, the mainline, if we're going to still use that term, Dick, there's so many ways to describe it. But the mainline churches was always, the sociological evidence seems to suggest that they were always out of touch with their members. Their members were always more conservative, and nobody has mentioned yet the kind of what's happening in all these churches, United Methodists and Presbyterians, and the churches that are kind of breaking up. So I'm wondering, one, if they always could expect it, but two, there's an overall question in a lot of these issues about, and I think it centers on abortion, is that Americans are really divided. I mean, in the media in a lot of ways would like to say that it's, it's one way or the other, and the media, there's questions whether there are different parts of the media that are more supportive of one side or the other. But like, for example, 80% of Americans say they do not approve of government paying for abortions, but they pay, but they have a completely different view of other aspects. It's such a comprehensive, and there's very little talk of the realities of how nuanced many people are on the abortion issue. So I lost my question, so I'm going to have somebody bail me out here. Corwin?
Well, let me just make a comment about the division between, let's say, clergy and laity in some of the larger denominations. In recent years, there are these very large surveys that have been done in the United States of 50,000 plus in each election. And as you know, David, I've done surveys of clergy over the last couple decades, every 8 years or so. Recently at a paper this past weekend, we were looking at to what extent do the political orientations of laity in 6 large denominations, where you can sort of, because you've got the 50,000 respondents, you can sort of look at to what extent the clergy in those denominations mirror the laity in those denominations with some confidence. So these are Protestant denominations, 3 mainline, 3 evangelical, what I label evangelical denominations. Actually, the clergy take different stands to the laity in all the denominations. The clergy are more conservative and Republican than the laity in the more evangelical denominations. And in the mainline, what we label mainline denominations, the clergy are more ideologically liberal and democratic than the laity in their denominations. And I'm comparing whites to whites here. The Assemblies of God has a higher non-white constituency, and so we're just trying to compare the whites in those denominations. So we thought there might be a gathering storm in the churches, that old book done by Jeff Haddon in the 60s, and we were trying to update that a little and see to what extent that was still true. With regard to abortion, and obviously politicians and parties seek to make it an issue in which they think they may be able to win votes. But I do think there is a general consensus within American politics, if you start moving down, that at least the option should be available in certain cases. Now, how wide that option should be, that's the debatable point. But whether all abortions should be eliminated, I don't know that there's really much of a stand for that. But obviously some people feel that to go in a higher restricted rate might have some political payoffs, and so they're doing that.
I might throw in this from John Green at the University of Akron. I heard him speak at a conference about a decade after the Roe v. Wade decision. Now, you might say, as I mentioned, white Catholics going in the Republican direction. So you might say, oh, well, they're doing that because of the abortion issue. Nuance. He said, no, that's not what's happening. What happened in that critical period a couple decades ago is that because of the abortion decision, Catholics felt freer to vote Republican if they wanted to vote Republican on totally different issues having nothing to do with abortion. In other words, it cut that umbilical cord between the Democratic Party and American Catholics, which went back for a century, back when immigrants were being opposed by Protestants and so on. I think that's a very interesting insight, and it shows you how completely tricky these religion and politics factors can be.
Absolutely. Well, let me also ask all the panelists just this overall question for the benefit of all of our colleagues. What do you think North American journalists are doing particularly well in covering religion? And where do you think there are areas of needed improvement or correction? And Corwin would also be interested in your perspective from a more analytical academic perspective as well. Please, anyone go ahead.
Well, I'll punch in. Yeah, evangelicals have been covered like a blanket since 1979. I mean, we had the 974th example in the New York Times, page 1, several days ago, about, again, evangelicals and politics. I mean, how many times have you seen that? See very little about my Catholic point or anything of the sort. So evangelicals are not only well covered, but overly covered. Everybody else suffers by comparison. And there is a lot going on in organized Judaism right now. And, we could go on. The Mormon situation in the United States is very interesting right now. And I could go on and on.
Alejandra?
Yeah, I do agree that we do tend to cover a lot of evangelicalism and evangelical leaders. And one thing, when I'm based in California, in Southern California, and when I tell people about Religion News Service, or when I say that I'm a reporter for Religion News Service, people automatically assume that we're a Christian news publication. And so a lot of what I do is kind of help educate, like, no, we cover all faiths, all religions, all spirituality. And that just kind of shows that if there is religion coverage, it often is about Christianity or evangelicalism. And here in California, we have a lot of faiths represented here. And so I do my best in trying to cover a lot of them. I mean, there's a big Buddhism communities here. There's several mosques here in Southern California. There's big Jewish communities here. So a lot of what I do is I focus on covering Latinos and religion. That's what I was hired for at Religion News Service, to do more West Coast reporting on religion, but also try and do more coverage of religion and spirituality among Latino communities. So I think we are trying to kind of fill those gaps, because there is this assumption that automatically when people hear Religion News Service or anything about religion, they think automatically Christianity or evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Well, I think it's been a wonderful conversation. I think we're about coming to the time we prescribed. So I'd really like each of you to, well, as you would like, to offer any final thoughts in summing up. Please feel free. Let me first express my great gratitude to Andy Bayuni, who made all this possible, and to each of you. Wonderful group of 4 people. Thank you very much. So please offer any final thoughts.
I'll go in. Here's a political thought for you. Wow, evangelicals voted 80% for Trump, right? How many times have you seen that figure in the print? What was the number for Mitt Romney? 79%. Big news flash. White evangelicals vote Republican. White evangelicals vote conservative, even when a Mormon is running for president.
Let me build on that a little bit. I just published an article in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion that is entitled "Born Again versus Evangelical. Does the Difference Make a Difference?" And I was actually trying to get at the question that's asked in many surveys is, do you consider yourself a born again or evangelical Christian? But it's unclear whether people are saying they're born again or evangelical, or whether they're saying they're both born again and evangelical. So to the extent you can find surveys that ask the born again question separate from an evangelical identity question, do you find that the results are different? And you do. I won't go into the details, but it's really much more accurate to say, because more people will claim to be born again than will claim to be an evangelical. It's far more accurate to say that 81% of born again white voters voted for Trump than to say 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. But it's that's the scholarly side on here rather than the journalistic side. So I'll leave it at that.
We need more scholars. You correct us. You've corrected me over the years.
So up here in Canada, we could benefit from having more reporters who have some religious expertise. The Winnipeg Free Press, which I write for, is the only daily newspaper in Canada with a religion beat now. So when we do tend to hear about religion from the United States, it tends to be the low-hanging fruit, the scandals, the outrageous comments, the voting for Trumps, whatever. There really isn't enough examination of the issues, going deeper into them, parsing out the nuance. That's what we need more of here in Canada, both for religious people in our own country, but also to handle the tidal wave of news which comes our direction from the South.
Hey, John, can I also mention our mutual friend, Doug Todd? Doug still does some reporting on religion, doesn't he?
He does. It's one of his beats. It's no longer his only beat.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, John, for joining us. Alejandra, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess one thing we're trying to do right now at RNS is examine and explore how churches and worship spaces have changed after the pandemic in terms of in-person connection. There's less restrictions right now, and we're trying to see if the same amount of congregants are returning than before the pandemic, and if a lot of churches and worship spaces got a lot of new people tuning into their online services. And so we're wondering, well, how do you even minister to those people if they may be out of state? What is that connection? What is a pastor's connection with those that just started tuning into their services online? And so we're kind of exploring that right now to see how the church and different worship spaces look as we're kind of resuming. There's less restrictions at the moment, so we're trying to see what that looks like.
Just to build on that, I spent a semester in Budapest over a decade ago with the college that I was associated with. attended an English-speaking congregation there, but with the live streaming and so forth, I've become reconnected with that particular congregation and with the refugee work that they're doing right now, given the Ukrainian situation. So it is an interesting question, yes.
Dick, did you already offer a final thought?
Yeah, well, I threw in one little, exit poll tidbit.
Oh,
But I'll say this, the much ignored third branch of world Christianity, along with Catholic and Protestant, we have Eastern Orthodox. This Ukraine-Russia situation is a cataclysm of the highest order for the Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity. We could go into detail about that, but that's something to keep your eye on. A good place to look in is the upcoming Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Germany, the first week of September, where this is really going to come to a head in an interesting way.
well, thank you so much to everyone. And it's been a privilege to be a part of this dialogue. And before we go, all of this will be posted on Facebook, and the story will be posted on the iARJ website. And it's the iarj.org. We welcome you to visit the site for any number of reasons. But well, thank you again, and thank you, Andy.